The pen in my hand didn't shake, but my father's did. You could see the tremor in his knuckles as the fluorescent light from the recessed ceiling hit the glossy paper I'd just slid across the polished oak table. The office was too cold, the kind of over-conditioned chill that seeped through my blazer and raised goosebumps along my arms. Outside, the floor-to-ceiling windows, Manhattan traffic hummed like distant bees, but inside, Mark Ellison's conference room, you could have heard a pin drop. My father stared at the number at the bottom of the page, $112,000, while my mother's perfume, sharp and floral, crowded the air between us. "So, you're saying," my father whispered, his voice rough and low, "we'd lose $68 million just to move our own money away from you." His face, usually so tanned and confident, looked almost gray in the cool, white light. My mother's manicured fingers tightened around the leather armrest, her diamond bracelet catching a harsh flash as she moved, scattering little shards of light across the dark wood. Somewhere behind us, the air conditioner clicked and sighed, steady and indifferent. I sat straighter in my chair, feeling the texture of the leather press into my back, like a reminder that I belonged at this table. "No," I said quietly, my throat dry, but my voice steady. "You'd lose $68 million in taxes to regain control of what you think is your money. 95% of that portfolio is legally owned by my firm. I'm offering you an exit route." My words felt heavy in my mouth, each one dropping between us like a stone into deep water. Mark glanced between us, his tablet screen glowing a faint bluish white on his face. The faint tapping of his finger on glass was the only sound for a beat, Mr. and Mrs. "Hayes," he said gently, "your daughter is giving you a choice. Most advisors wouldn't. I've reviewed the documents. Everything she's described, it all checks out." The hum of the building's ventilation seemed to grow louder as my father's eyes finally lifted from the page and fixed on mine. For the first time in my adult life, he looked at me like he genuinely didn't know who he was looking at. "You can stay," I said, feeling my heartbeat thudding against the edge of my blazer like a trapped bird. "Acknowledge that I've been the one building this, and we keep everything intact. Or you can walk away and pay for the privilege of pretending I had nothing to do with your success." My mother swallowed, and I watched the movement of her throat, the way her red lipstick looked too bright in the cool office light. The smell of coffee from the sideboard had gone bitter and cold. This was the moment, the one I'd replayed in my head on sleepless nights for years, never quite believing it would actually come. Before we go on, tell me where you're listening from and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt overlooked by the people who should have cared for you. My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm 31 years old, and if you ran a quick search on me, you'd probably think I was just another struggling millennial with a cheap apartment and a job I can't quite explain at family dinners. Most mornings start the same way: the hiss of my ancient coffee machine, the faint smell of burnt grounds, and the soft buzz of the city drifting in through the cracked kitchen window of my one-bedroom walk-up in Queens. The linoleum under my bare feet is always a little too cold, a little too worn, but I've grown oddly fond of it. It's the sort of place my parents describe as temporary housing, the way you talk about a layover you're embarrassed to admit you booked. To them, I've always been the flaky one. My father Richard made his money, or believes he did, in commercial real estate. He smells like expensive cologne and cigar smoke more nights than not, his voice booming as he tells the same stories about smart moves and gut instincts. My mother Diane floats through life in soft silk and spa scents, all lavender and powder, her bracelets clinking gently whenever she lifts a glass at the country club. They live in a wide front brick colonial in Westchester, with white columns, a sweeping driveway, and hedges trimmed so precisely they look like they're measured with a ruler. The leather of their dining chairs squeaks softly when you sit down, the crystal chandelier over the table throwing warm light across gleaming silverware and perfectly folded napkins. At that table, My entire childhood money was something my father discussed with other men, voices lowered over clinking ice, and the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hallway. My role, even as a teenager, was to refill the breadbasket, laugh at the right moments, and clear plates while they talked about cap rates and stock tips I understood better than they realized. When I'd open my mouth to say something about a company's balance sheet or a sector trend, I'd read about my father would smile without really looking at me and say, "Let the guys handle this lore. Go help your mom in the kitchen." The smell of roasting meat and garlic would follow me as I walked away, my cheeks burning hotter than the oven. It didn't start out as cruelty, not exactly. More like 1,000 tiny dismissals that blended into the wallpaper. My mother patting my hand, her skin soft and cool, saying, "You're so creative, sweetheart. Numbers are more your father's thing. You should do something fun, something pretty." My older cousin Jake, the unofficial golden child, because he worked in real finance downtown, would slap me lightly on the shoulder, the fabric of his suit crisp and expensive. "You're overthinking it, Lore," he'd chuckle as the TV murmured stock tickers in the background. "You're artsy. You'd hate the grind." The words never fit right in my ears. But I learned to smile. I learned to make jokes about being bad with money, even as I secretly aced every math exam I touched. The first real crack in whatever we were pretending to be as a family came the night I graduated from college. I still remember the feel of the stiff polyester gown against my bare arms, and the way the air smelled like cut grass and hot asphalt after the ceremony. We went to a steakhouse afterward, one of those dark, wood-paneled places where the lights are low and the waiters glide silently in black vests. My diploma folder sat on the table next to my water glass. The words, "Bachelor of Science in Finance," embossed in gold. I kept running my thumb over when nobody was looking. I had spent 4 years devouring every course I could find on markets portfolio theory risk management. Numbers made sense to me in a way people never had. So when the waiter cleared our plates and the sound of dishes clinking faded back toward the kitchen, I took a breath, felt the weight of the heavy linen napkin in my lap, and said, "Dad, I've been thinking I'd really like to help you with your investments. Maybe start by reviewing your holdings. Look at how you're diversified." He didn't even let me finish. The candlelight on the table flickered across his face as he laughed low and amused, and reached over to give my hand a little pat, like I was still 12 and asking to drive his car. "Sweetheart," he said, his voice warm but edged with something I couldn't name back then. "Leave the grown-up money talk to people who understand it. Okay, you're the creative one. You should be thinking about something fun, marketing, photography." "I don't know. You'd hate this stuff." My mother smiled over the rim of her wine glass, the red catching the light. "He's right, Lauren. Don't stress yourself with numbers. Find a nice job, a nice man, and let the experts handle the complicated things." The steakhouse felt suddenly smaller, the low murmur of other people's conversations pressing in on me from every direction. I could smell grilled meat and butter and someone's sharp aftershave from the next table over. My diploma caught the light when I looked down the gold lettering, suddenly feeling like a joke only I was in on. I remember forcing a laugh hearing it come out thin and strange. My cousin raised his glass and said, "To Lauren, the future artist or whatever she decides to be." And everyone clinked crystal, the sound bright and hollow in my ears. I didn't argue. I didn't pull out the sample analysis I'd done of my dad's last 3 commercial deals tucked neatly into the folder under my diploma. I folded the napkin slowly, feeling the texture of the fabric under my fingers, and let the conversation move on without me. That was the night I stopped trying to be heard at that table. The night I decided if they weren't going to see me as someone who understood money, I'd build something so undeniable that one day, whether they were ready or not, they'd be forced to. Years later, when my mother called and said, "Honey, your father and I have a meeting with a new wealth manager in the city this weekend. You should come," It'll be good for you to hear how real professionals talk about money. I felt that old sting at the back of my throat like the ghost of that steakhouse candle smoke. I agreed anyway. On Saturday, I walked into Mark Ellison's sleek midtown office. Behind them, the marble floors cool under my heels, the air smelling faintly of coffee and leather. My father shook Mark's hand with his usual booming confidence as my mother adjusted her pearl earring in the reflection of the glass door. They sat in the big chairs at the head of the table. I took the one slightly off to the side where the leather still felt stiff and new, and listened as my father started explaining his impressive portfolio, having no idea the person who built it was sitting 3 feet away. When I was 11, I stood at the edge of my parents' long mahogany dining table, the lace tablecloth brushing my fingertips, as if it wanted to pull me closer. Candles flickered, throwing soft orange light across crystal glasses, and the carved turkey steaming in the center. My father tapped his wine glass with a fork, the sharp ring cutting through the hum of grown-up laughter. "Let's hear what everyone's thankful for," he said, his voice warm and booming, the kind that filled the whole room. I opened my mouth, ready to share something small, something I'd rehearsed quietly on the carpet upstairs. But before I could speak, my cousin Jake leaned back in his chair and said, "Let's skip Lauren. She hasn't done anything yet." The scrape of his chair legs on the hardwood echoed louder than it should have. My cheeks burned hot, the smell of sage stuffing suddenly thick in my nose. My father chuckled lightly, waving it off, and moved on to the next person without looking at me. The candle beside me let out a faint pop as the wax shifted, and I stared at the flame until the whole room blurred. Even now, when I close my eyes, I can still feel the soft heat of that candle on my face, and the way the room swallowed my silence without a second thought. That moment stayed with me longer than I realized, drifting into the corners of my memory until it became part of the wallpaper of my life. Back then, moments like that were the quiet rules of our home, so subtle, they seemed normal. The house in Westchester was always kept a little too cool, the marble floors sending a chill through my socks as I walked from room to room. My father liked the air conditioning running high, even in winter, because he said it made the place feel crisp. That crispness seeped into everything. The way he'd glance at me over his reading glasses when I asked a question about the news. The way my mother's bracelets would softly clink as she adjusted the place settings, her smile warm but distant whenever I tried to help. My parents loved me in the way people love something they don't fully understand, carefully, politely, as though too much warmth might break me. When the adults talked money at family gatherings, the low murmur of their voices filled the living room like background music. Ice clinked softly in tumblers, the smell of bourbon mixing with the fireplace smoke. I'd sit on the edge of the velvet sofa, listening, absorbing everything. But the moment I leaned forward and said something, anything, my father would tilt his head, give a small laugh and say, "Sweetheart, you're too young to worry about that." Then he'd ruffle my hair gently the way you might pet a nervous dog, and turn back to Jake, who was only 5 years older but already one of the men. Through high school, it continued. I'd come home from AP Calculus with a perfect score, the test paper still warm from the copy machine smelling faintly of toner. My father would give a half-hearted smile and say, "That's nice, Laure, but don't forget to have fun. Girls your age shouldn't bury themselves in numbers." Meanwhile, Jake's B- in a basic economics class would earn him a celebratory dinner. I remember the metallic clatter of pots as my mother cooked his favorite meal while telling me, "Your cousin's going places. You should take notes." By college, I had learned the rhythm of being overlooked. I understood when to speak and when to hold my tongue, how to laugh at the appropriate times, and how to make myself small when conversations drifted toward anything I cared about. I moved through those years like a quiet observer, The world around me sharp with detail, the smell of old books in the finance library, the scratch of pencils on exam paper, the cold metal of the lecture hall chairs against the back of my legs. I excelled. Silently. Consistently. Invisibly. After graduating, the patterns only intensified. Every holiday, I'd walk into the house and feel the temperature drop literally and figuratively. The air would smell faintly of pine candles and polished wood, and my parents would greet me with the same familiar script. My mother's hands cool on my arms as she smiled and said, "How's your little gig going, Gig?" No matter what job I took, no matter what success I quietly earned, it was always a gig to her. Something temporary. Something cute. The worst part wasn't that they underestimated me. It was that they assumed I couldn't possibly mind, as though being treated like a harmless accessory was the natural order of things. On Christmas mornings after the coffee machine sputtered and hissed with its usual uneven rhythm, my father would hand Jake a new briefcase, a leather one that still smelled rich and earthy, fresh from the store. To me, he once handed a pretty journal with a floral cover and said, "For your ideas, sweetheart. You have such imagination." I remember sitting on the couch afterward, turning the journal over in my hands, feeling the soft grain of the cover under my fingertips. My stomach was tight, my breath shallow. I didn't need imagination. I needed to be seen. It wasn't always loud. Sometimes the hurt came in small, delicate moments, almost invisible from the outside. Like the afternoon I overheard my mother talking to her friend in the sunroom, the smell of her lavender candle drifting down the hallway. "Lauren's a dreamer," she said, her voice soft, almost fond. "She's sweet, but she just doesn't have a head for practical things. Richard and I will have to make sure she's taken care of long term." I stood there hidden behind the doorframe, the sunlight warm on my arm, as if the house itself were trying to comfort me. But the warmth didn't reach the cold knot in my chest. Over time, the message settled into me like dust into old carpet. You aren't capable. You aren't responsible. You aren't someone we trust. And because I had heard it for so long, because it came wrapped in the soft familiarity of home and routine, I believed it. Or at least part of me did. That belief is a quiet thing, like an echo from a far-off room. You can't quite shut the door on. It doesn't shout. It just hums under your skin until you mistake it for your own voice. By the time I was 22 and sitting in that steakhouse with my diploma beside my plate, the smell of buttered rolls lingering in the air, I had already learned not to expect anything different. When my father laughed at my offer to help with the family's finances, it didn't surprise me. It barely even stung. What hurt was how familiar it felt, how predictable, the way the candlelight softened their faces while hardening something inside me. That was the night I realized my parents didn't see me, not really. They saw the version of me they had built over years of gentle dismissals and polite underestimations. It didn't matter what I knew, what I had achieved, or what I dreamed of. They had written a story about who I was, and they expected me to play along. And I did. For a while. It was easier than fighting. Easier than pushing back against the tide of their assumptions. So I stayed quiet. I let them believe they were right about me, even as I began building something entirely different in the shadows of their expectations. The silence became a shield, a place where I could grow without interference or judgment. But that silence came with a price. Every holiday dinner, every phone call laced with subtle condescension, every conversation where they spoke around me instead of to me, it all gathered inside me like layers of sediment. The weight of unspoken truths pressing deeper and deeper, forming a kind of emotional bedrock I carried into adulthood. I didn't realize how heavy it had become until the day it cracked. It was a Saturday morning in late fall. The sky outside my queen's apartment was a pale gray, the kind that makes the whole world feel a little muted. The radiator in my living room clicked to life, the metal pipes warming with a soft groan. My phone buzzed on the counter, the screen lighting up in the dim room. It was my mother. "Honey," she said, when I answered, her voice smooth and cheerful. "Your father and I have an appointment with a new wealth manager this afternoon. You should come. It'll be good for you to hear how professionals talk about investments." The radiator hissed behind me, spreading a faint warmth into the chilly air. I remember leaning against the counter, feeling the cool edge of the marble press into my hip, and thinking how strange it was to feel both numb and furious at the same time. I didn't know it then, not fully, but something was shifting. The quiet parts of my life, the ones I kept tucked away in drawers and encrypted files, were inching closer to the light. The narrative they built about me was starting to fray at the edges. And in the hours that followed, sitting in Mark Ellison's sleek office with its glass walls and the low hum of air vents, the first tear in that story would widen just enough to let the truth slip through. The office lights dimmed for just a second, a faint flicker that passed across the glossy conference table like a shadow brushing water. My phone buzzed in my lap, one sharp vibration that cut through Mark Ellison's polished voice as he explained fee structures to my parents. I slid the phone under the table, the cool metal brushing my fingertips. A new message banner lit the screen, throwing pale light across my hands. "Urgent. Call me." "Victor." I pressed the phone to my ear so quietly, my mother didn't even pause her sentence. On the other end, Victor's voice came through in a low, tense whisper, the faint hum of our office servers filling the background. "Lauren Morrison Wealth just filed a full transparency request. Beneficial ownership. Structure. Every vehicle." I felt my throat tighten. The exhale that slipped out of me fogged the edge of the glass tabletop. "If we comply," he continued, "they'll see everything. Your name, your signature, the shell companies, all of it." I stared at my parents, my father gesturing proudly at a chart he didn't understand, my mother touching her pearls with that small, satisfied smile. The room seemed too bright, the air too thin. "You need to decide," Victor said. "They'll have the truth in 72 hours. My hand trembled just once before I lowered the phone. The faint smell of Mark's fresh coffee drifting across the table as I looked up at the people who had built their lives on the belief that I was incapable of much more than daydreaming. For a moment, I couldn't hear anything but the blood rushing in my ears, a dull roar beneath the muffled sound of my father's voice. The shock didn't feel like surprise. It felt like recognition, like something long buried had finally surfaced. I told Victor I'd call him back, then slipped out of the room. The hallway was cooler than the conference space, the tile floor cold through the soles of my shoes. I leaned against the wall, the paint smooth beneath my palm, and tried to steady my breath. The truth had always been there, humming quietly beneath the life I let my parents believe I lived. It started to unravel in my hands that morning, as if the threads had been waiting for one pull. Victor's warning forced me to look at something I'd avoided fully acknowledging. The structure I'd built wasn't just efficient, it was unavoidably traceable. The firms, the vehicles, the trusts, the signatures. Everything pointed back to me. And now someone outside my carefully constructed world was about to tug on every thread. When I walked back into the conference room, the soundscape hit me harder than before. My father's low, confident laugh, the faint buzz of Mark's tablet, the soft rustling of my mother's silk blouse as she shifted in her seat. I could smell the subtle sweetness of her perfume, warm like vanilla and sharp at the edges. They sat there so certain of who they were and how well they'd done. So certain the nameless professionals had been guiding them all these years. They had no idea the person they dismissed daily had been the one making every decision that built their comfort. What Victor told me wasn't just a warning. It was a revelation. For years, I'd been so careful signing documents under sterling entities, keeping my name professionally separate, ensuring every structure served dual purposes, tax efficiency for them, protection for me. My parents had always handed over their accounts the same way they handed me grocery lists as a teenager, confident I couldn't possibly mess anything up. They never bothered to ask who signed the quarterly performance statements, who drafted the investment strategy notes, who decided to pull their money out of a collapsing REIT before it cratered. Everything came with the sterling header, and that was all they cared to know. And now an independent advisor was about to see the truth in cold print. Their portfolio, more than $170 million of it, wasn't theirs. Not legally, not structurally, not by any interpretation that mattered to the IRS or the SEC. I had built them a kingdom, but I had also built myself the keys. That fact sat heavy in my chest as I replayed Victor's words. They'll see everything. He wasn't talking about numbers. He meant history. He meant the long, private record of a daughter who fixed every mess her parents made without ever being allowed to say she knew how. I looked at my mother's hands resting lightly on her lap, her nails pale pink and perfectly shaped. I remembered being 16 and sitting beside her in that same posture, both of us listening to the whir of an old ceiling fan while my father explained compound interest to Jake. My mother had leaned over the soft scent of rose lotion drifting toward me and whispered, "Let him talk, sweetheart. It's important he feels smart." That whisper had become a script I lived by, which is why the evidence I had, now found accidental though it was, hit me with the force of a second childhood. Standing in that polished conference room, I saw every oversight and every dismissal differently, clearer, sharper. As if someone had cleaned the windows on a view I'd been squinting through for years. It wasn't just that they didn't see me. It was that they had never wanted to. The truth Victor warned me about, that their accounts were structured in a way that gave me legal authority, had roots in countless moments I had brushed aside. My father's refusal to read anything more complicated than a single-page summary. My mother's habit of signing documents without asking a single question. Their pride in thinking they were savvy enough to trust the right advisors. They had never imagined their daughter could be one of those advisors. So they never looked. That blindness, habitual, casual absolute was the real betrayal. And suddenly, I understood the whole architecture of my life. The silence I kept, the smallness I performed, the careful distance I maintained. It wasn't just strategy. It was survival. It was protection in a family where competence was welcomed only when it didn't overshadow the people who believed competence was their birthright. As Mark flipped through documents on the screen, his voice steady and warm, I watched my parents beam at charts they didn't comprehend. My father traced a line on a graph with a fingertip, his skin leaving a faint smudge on the glass. My mother nodded, her eyes bright, as if she'd personally spotted every high-performing asset. Something inside me clicked. It wasn't anger. Not yet. It was clarity, the kind that arrives so quietly, it feels like a whisper brushing the back of your neck. I returned to the hallway phone pressed tight against my ear and called Victor back. He answered before the second ring. "What do you want to do?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the hum of office ventilation. I stared through the glass wall at my parents, so confident, so unaware. The overhead lights cast a soft reflection across the room, blurring their outlines just slightly, as if distance had finally taken a physical shape. For the first time, the truth didn't scare me. It steadied me. "They're going to find out," I said, "and I'm done protecting the version of me they prefer." The words felt solid in my mouth like stones polished smooth by years of pressure. Victor exhaled long and quiet. "Then we prepare everything." I hung up and returned to my seat. The leather felt firmer beneath me than it had before, the cold air brushing against the back of my neck like a reminder. My father looked over and gave that small, indulgent smile he used on me when he thought I didn't understand what was happening. In that moment, the last piece of the puzzle slid into place. They weren't wrong by accident. They weren't blind out of ignorance. They were blind because they chose to be. They needed me to be small so their story made sense. And now the story was cracking open. I folded my hands on the table, the cool wood smooth under my palms, and felt something shift deep in my chest. Not rage, not hurt. Resolve. The kind that comes only after you've seen every piece of the truth. By the time Mark asked if we were ready to move forward with next steps, I already knew mine. I wasn't going to hide anymore. The years of quiet competence, the decades of being miscast, the weight of every candlelit dinner where my voice didn't matter, they were all converging on a single point. I was done living in the background of my own story. The conference room had gone so still the air itself felt breakable. My father's pen froze halfway to the signature line. My mother's breath caught sharp and audible in the cool, recycled air. And I, standing now instead of sitting, clicked the clasp on the leather folder I had placed in the center of the table. The sound was soft, but it cut through the room like a knife. Papers slid out under the fluorescent light, each page reflecting a pale shimmer across the polished wood. My father reached for one, stopped, and pulled his hand back as if the paper might burn him. Mark Ellison's tablet chimed once, a quiet notification echoing in the silence. My heart thudded once hard and steady as I set the document flat in front of them. "This," I said, my voice low, but carrying, "is the truth you've been signing for 6 years." My mother whispered, "Lauren." "What is this?" But the words barely made it past her lips. For a second, no one breathed. And in that charged, fragile quiet, I waited for the first crack to appear. How we reached that moment wasn't luck. It was choice quiet, deliberate, overdue. When I walked out of the hallway and back into the room earlier that afternoon, I felt the shift inside me like a door swinging shut. All those years of silence weren't weakness. They were preparation. And now, the structure I'd built carefully privately was the only thing standing between them and financial ruin they never even knew they'd risked. I had come armed not with vengeance, but with clarity. Before entering the room again, I ducked into the small printing alcove off the corridor. The printer hummed with warm, rhythmic clicks, filling the narrow space with the faint smell of hot toner and paper dust. One by one, the document slid out structural diagrams of the trusts, the beneficial ownership tables, the authorizations they had signed without reading, and finally the management agreements showing Sterling, not them, held legal control of the assets. As I gathered the pages, the warmth from the machine seeped into my fingers. The papers were warm, almost alive. Evidence always feels heavier when it carries truth people aren't ready to face. I walked back down the hallway slowly, the carpet muffling my steps. Through the glass wall ahead, I saw my parents laughing with Mark bodies, relaxed confidence radiating from them like heat from asphalt on a summer afternoon. They had no idea a tide was about to turn under their feet. I took a breath, pushed the door open, and the cool air of the conference room washed over me with its faint coffee and lemon cleaner scent. And then the moment began to unfold. My father finally picked up the first page. His hand shook slightly, the paper rustling loud in the quiet room. My mother leaned closer, her perfume, something soft and floral, lifting as she inhaled sharply. "Lauren," my father said, voice gravelly, "what exactly am I looking at?" Something in his tone suggested he already knew. "Ownership structure," I said. "The one you authorized, the one you never asked about." Mark cleared his throat and angled his tablet so the screen light reflected softly across his glasses. "Mr. Hayes, this is consistent with what I'm seeing on my end." My father shot him a look sharp enough to cut glass. I turned to both of them, resting my hand lightly on the table. "You didn't just give Sterling discretionary authority. You assigned beneficial ownership to the investment vehicles I manage." "Impossible," my father snapped, but the tremor in his jaw betrayed him. "You've never read the documents," I said. "Not once." My mother's hand went to her throat. "We trusted our advisor. We thought—" "You trusted the person behind Sterling," I said, without knowing who she was. My father slammed his palm down, the sharp crack echoing against the glass walls. "This is manipulation." "No," I said evenly. "This is what you signed." Silence folded over the room again. And then came the twist, one I didn't expect until Mark shifted in his seat. "There's something else," he said, glancing at me first, then at them. "Something your daughter didn't bring up yet." I frowned. "What are you talking about?" He tapped his tablet, the soft tapping like distant rain. "Your father provided us with documentation, including an authorization letter from you, Lauren, granting him full decision-making power over your supposed accounts." My blood chilled. "What authorization?" Mark turned the screen toward me. My name, my full legal name, handwritten in looping strokes, I recognized from somewhere I didn't want to remember, sat neatly under a signature line. Except it wasn't mine. My father stiffened. My mother blinked rapidly, her mouth falling open in small, stunned breaths. "That's not my signature," I said quietly. Mark nodded. I suspected as much. Slowly, carefully, he slid the tablet toward me. My fingers brushed the screen, the glass cool under my touch. The date on the document was 3 years old. The handwriting looked eerily similar to mine, similar enough for someone impatient and overconfident to believe it would pass. My jaw tightened. "Dad, did you sign this for me?" He didn't answer. My mother looked from him to the tablet, and back, her voice a thin whisper. "Richard, tell me you didn't." He rubbed his temples, avoided my gaze, and exhaled hard through his nose. "It was to keep things simple. You kept saying you weren't interested in financial matters. I didn't want to bother you with paperwork." The room froze. I felt the air move differently after he said it, colder, sharper. He forged my signature. On a financial authorization. To take control of accounts I didn't even have, because he believed I couldn't be trusted with money. And worse, he didn't deny it. He justified it. My mother recoiled, as if a cold wind had passed through her. "Richard." "My God." Mark leaned back slowly, his voice low. "Mr. Hayes, this is legally serious. Fraudulent authorization on financial documentation is—" "I know what it is," my father said sharply, his face flushing a deep red. But he didn't apologize. Not to me. Not to anyone. He just sat there, jaw clenched, the weight of what he'd done pressing the air from the room. I straightened my spine. "You forged my name to control something you didn't trust me with. And all the while I was the one controlling everything that kept you afloat." He stared at me, eyes narrowing, a flicker of something, shame or pride or fear, crossing his face. My voice stayed steady. This ends now. I turned to Mark. As of today, I'm reclaiming the full legal authority I already hold. No more hidden signatures, no more decisions made behind my back. Everything moves through me directly. My father shot up from his chair. You can't dictate terms to me. I'm not dictating, I said. I'm stating reality. The leather of his chair creaked as he pushed it back, the legs scraping against the floor with an ugly sound. My mother's hand fluttered as though she wanted to reach for him but didn't dare. I looked between them. The parents who had underestimated me dismissed me, and now, in desperation, had tried to quietly take something from me. Something they didn't think I'd notice. But I had, and now everyone else saw it too. Mark's voice broke the silence. For what it's worth, Lauren, you've handled this with more professionalism than most people could manage. My mother's eyes filled with tears, not dramatic, just quiet and real. She looked at me as if she were seeing me for the first time. Lauren, she whispered, I didn't know. I nodded. I know you didn't, but now you do. My father opened his mouth to speak, but whatever words he had died before reaching his tongue. His shoulders sagged just slightly, the stiff lines of his posture loosening for the first time in years. The room felt larger then, as if the walls had shifted outward. I gathered the documents, slid them neatly back into the leather folder, and snapped it shut. The soft click echoed like punctuation. Then I stepped back from the table. My father stared at me, stunned into stillness. My mother looked heartbroken, but awake. Mark leaned back, watching all of us with the quiet respect of someone who'd seen a truth unfold that no one could pretend away. I walked toward the glass door. No one stopped me. Behind me, the room stayed frozen, silent, stunned, suspended in the moment the balance of power finally shifted. And for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small when I walked away. When the glass door shut behind me, the world went strangely quiet. The hallway outside the conference room was washed in soft afternoon light, a pale gold that slipped across the carpet and touched my shoes with warmth. My breath came out slow and steady, no longer tangled with the noise I'd left behind. I kept walking until the voices inside faded into nothing, replaced by the faint hum of the elevators and the distant whir of the building's ventilation. For the first time in years, the air felt different, lighter, cleaner, almost cool against my skin. Something had shifted, not with a crash, but with a click, like a lock, turning in a long, stuck door. I paused at the end of the hallway and let the quiet settle around me like a new beginning. It would take a long time for the echoes of that moment to soften, but the path forward had already begun to unfold. The next morning, sunlight poured over my kitchen counter in thin, warm bands, catching the steam rising from my coffee. I stood there with the mug cupped between my hands, letting the heat seep into my fingers as I reviewed the signed documents my parents had sent overnight. They had chosen the path that kept everything intact and placed me formally and openly in the role I'd held for years. There was no celebration attached to it, no flourish or apology. Just the quiet acceptance of a truth that could no longer be avoided. I saved the files, closed my laptop, and let the silence hold me for a moment. Taking back what was mine wasn't loud or triumphant. It was patient. It was gentle. It was choosing to breathe without asking for permission. Over the weeks that followed, I began reclaiming pieces of my life I had ignored for too long. I spent late evenings in my apartment repainting the scuffed walls in soft, warm colors that made the space feel like somewhere I actually lived instead of somewhere I hid. The smell of fresh paint lingered in the air, clean and slightly sweet, mixing with the faint scent of my lemon soap as I scrubbed old marks from the baseboards. Bit by bit, the rooms brightened. The shadows retreated. I opened the windows, often letting in cool breezes that lifted the curtains and carried the sounds of the neighborhood dog's distant traffic, someone playing jazz, through an open window down the street. It felt like reclaiming a home, but also a self. At the same time, I set boundaries that had been missing for most of my life. My parents called often, at first tentative, unsteady. The conversations were careful, wrapped in long pauses and the occasional shaky breath. My father tried once to defend his forged signature, saying he thought he was helping. I didn't argue. I simply said, "That can never happen again," in a voice that sounded more like my own than anything I'd said to him before. My mother's apologies came in small gestures rather than words. A softer tone, a longer silence before reacting, an unfamiliar willingness to listen. I didn't rush to forgive them. Healing isn't fast. But I let the distance stand. It was the healthiest thing for all of us. Meanwhile, the people who had seen me clearly all along stepped closer. Victor checked in more often, sometimes with brief notes about a portfolio trend, other times with a simple, "making sure you're sleeping." His voice always carried the quiet steadiness of someone who knew the load I carried long before it was spoken aloud. After one long week, he dropped by the office with 2 coffees, setting one beside me without a word. The gesture was small, but the warmth radiating from the cup felt like an anchor. Even my neighbor's people I'd only shared polite greetings with for years seemed to notice a shift. Mrs. Alvarez from across the hall knocked one evening with a container of homemade chicken soup, steam drifting gently from under the lid. "You look tired, sweetheart," she said, her voice soft as blankets. "Eat something warm." The kindness made something inside me unclench. Little by little, a new version of my life began to take shape. A version where I didn't hide behind silence or shrink to fit someone else's idea of who I should be. I expanded into my own space, my own voice, my own worth. I also returned to the parts of myself I had abandoned, the parts not tied to numbers or strategy. I bought a small potted lemon tree for my apartment, its leaves bright and fragrant. Each morning, I'd touch the soil, feel its cool, damp texture, and turn the pot so the little tree could catch the light spilling through the window. Caring for it became a quiet ritual, a reminder that growth isn't rushed. It unfurls, it steadies, it becomes. Work changed too, though the markets didn't notice. My returns remained strong, my clients steady, but I moved through those responsibilities with a new steadiness, a new clarity. The company I built no longer felt like a shield or a secret. It felt like a home I had created with my own 2 hands. My parents kept attending the monthly portfolio reviews. They listened more. They asked questions. My father stopped using that indulgent tone that once scraped against every raw place inside me. He wasn't perfect, not even close, but he was different. My mother's eyes softened when she looked at me, not with pity or worry, but with something that almost resembled pride. Whether they would ever fully understand the shape of what they'd done, how it formed the woman standing before them, I didn't know. And I didn't need to. Late one evening, long after the city lights flickered to life below my apartment windows, I stood by the glass with a cup of chamomile tea. The steam curled up toward my face, warm and floral, and outside, the streetlights glowed amber against the deep blue sky. I thought about everything that had happened, not with anger, but with a quiet sense of completion. The past no longer felt like a weight around my chest. It felt like foundation, messy, uneven, complicated, but strong enough to build on, strong enough to carry me forward. I wasn't the girl pushed aside at the dining table anymore. I wasn't the daughter whose voice dissolved under other people's assumptions. I wasn't invisible. I was the architect of my own life, the keeper of my own story. And the truth, long buried, long dismissed, finally had room to breathe. As I watched the city lights pulse softly in the distance, a breeze slipped through the open window, brushing my cheek with cool air that felt almost like a hand guiding me forward. I closed my eyes for a moment, letting the quiet settle into my bones. Some stories don't end with fireworks or applause. Some end with a breath steady, unhurried, and the understanding that survival isn't the same as living. And for the first time in a long time, I felt myself stepping fully into the life I'd earned, carrying a truth no one could take from me again.